Between 1943 and 1945, over 1,000 villages simply vanished from the map of Eastern Europe. Not evacuated, not relocated, erased. The churches were burned, the homes were leveled, and entire families were murdered in their sleep. We're talking about 100,000 people, maybe more, who disappeared in one of the most brutal ethnic cleansings you've never heard of. And here's the thing that'll blow your mind. The Nazis didn't do it, the Soviets didn't do it. Neighbors did it to neighbors. People who had lived side by side for generations suddenly turned on each other with a violence so systematic, so complete, that entire communities ceased to exist. This is the story of Volhynia and Eastern Galicia, and what happened there reveals something terrifying about human nature and what war can turn us into. If you're into real history that doesn't get taught in schools, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're going deep into one of World War II's darkest chapters. Let me paint you a picture of where this happened, because geography matters here. Imagine a region caught between empires, a borderland that nobody really controlled and everybody wanted. Volhynia and Eastern Galicia, these are areas that today sit partly in western Ukraine and partly in what used to be eastern Poland. But in the 1940s, these weren't neat border regions. They were a patchwork. Poles lived next to Ukrainians. Ukrainian villages sat beside Polish ones. Jews were scattered throughout. Germans had settled there generations ago. It was mixed, messy, and for centuries, that's just how it was. But here's what they didn't tell you in history class. This mixing wasn't peaceful coexistence. There was always tension simmering beneath the surface. The Poles had dominated politically for much of recent history. When Poland regained independence after World War I, these regions became part of the new Polish state. The problem? Ukrainians were the majority in many areas, but they had no real political power. They farmed the land, but Polish landlords often owned it. They spoke Ukrainian, but Polish was the language of government and education. The resentment built slowly, year after year. Think about it from the Ukrainian perspective for a second. After World War I, there was a brief, just a flash, where it seemed like Ukraine might become independent. The Western Ukrainian People's Republic declared itself in 1918. There were battles, negotiations, hopes for a free Ukrainian state. And then, it all collapsed. By 1921, Poland controlled Galicia and Volhynia, and that dream of independence was crushed. For many Ukrainians, especially the younger generation growing up in the 1920s and 1930s, that failure burned. It became the foundation for something much darker. Now, jump to 1939, and everything changes overnight. September 1939, Germany invades Poland from the west, and you know what happens next in that story. But here's what gets less attention. 17 days later, the Soviet Union invades from the east. Stalin and Hitler had already carved up Poland in a secret deal, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they called it. And suddenly, Volhynia and Eastern Galicia aren't Polish anymore. They're Soviet. The Soviets didn't come as liberators, though some Ukrainians initially hoped they might be. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, immediately started rounding people up. Polish officials, landowners, teachers, priests, anyone who represented the old Polish authority were arrested. Tens of thousands were deported to Siberia, entire families packed into cattle cars and shipped east to labor camps, most never to return. The Poles in these regions experienced Soviet occupation as a catastrophe. Many Ukrainians? They had mixed feelings. Some welcomed the end of Polish rule. Others quickly realized Soviet control meant something worse. But let me explain exactly what happened next, because this is where things get truly complicated. In June 1941, Hitler breaks his pact with Stalin and launches Operation Barbarossa. The German army smashes through Soviet lines and occupies these same regions within weeks. The Soviets retreat in chaos, but before they leave, they massacre thousands of prisoners rather than let them be freed. In cities like Lviv, the NKVD executes political prisoners by the thousands. When the Germans arrive and open the prisons, locals find rooms stacked with bodies. And here's the thing, the Germans immediately blame the Jews for these Soviet crimes, and local populations, traumatized and looking for revenge, are primed to believe it. The German occupation creates something historians call a power vacuum with teeth. Nazi Germany isn't interested in governing these rural backwaters efficiently. They want resources, they want slave labor, And they want Jews eliminated. But day-to-day control? That's loose, especially in the countryside. And into this vacuum steps the ONU, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Now, the ONU wasn't some fringe group. It had been building strength throughout the 1930s, recruiting young Ukrainians who were fed up with Polish rule and desperate for independence. They were radical nationalists, influenced by the fascist movements sweeping Europe. They believed in an ethnically pure Ukrainian state. They saw the German invasion as an opportunity. In fact, when the Germans first rolled into Lviv in 1941, the ONU declared Ukrainian independence. The Germans weren't having it. They arrested the ONU leaders and made it clear Ukraine would be a colony, not a partner. But the ONU didn't give up. They just went underground. By 1942, the ONU had created a military wing called the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. And here's what you need to understand about the UPA. They were fighting everyone. They fought the Germans when it suited them, they fought the Soviets when they could, but increasingly they focused on something else, removing the Polish population from what they considered Ukrainian land. Early 1943, that's when the violence begins. In earnest, January, February, villages in Volhynia start reporting attacks. Not robberies, not random violence, coordinated raids targeting Polish settlements. The UPA would surround a village at night, block the exits, and then methodically go house to house. They used axes, knives, and farm tools as much as guns. Why? Because bullets were scarce, but also because this was personal. This was about terrorizing, about making sure no Pole would ever feel safe in these regions again. The methods were systematic. They'd strike isolated villages first, places where there were no German garrisons nearby, no large Polish self-defense units. They'd kill everyone they found: men, women, children, elderly. The goal wasn't military victory, it was depopulation, ethnic cleansing, though that term wasn't commonly used yet. They wanted the Poles gone, fled, dead, didn't matter, just gone. Let me give you specific numbers because they're staggering. On a single night in March 1943 in the village of Lipnik, UPA forces killed over 180 people. In April, the village of Yanowa Dolina, roughly 600 dead. By summer, entire districts were being cleared. The Polish historian Władysław Simasko documented over 1,500 Polish settlements attacked between February and December 1943 in Volhynia alone. We're talking about hundreds of villages burned to the ground in less than a year. But here's where the story gets even more brutal. The Polish underground, the Armia Krajowa, or the Home Army, they're watching this happen. They're fighting the Germans, preparing for an uprising. But now they've got Polish civilians being massacred behind German lines by Ukrainian nationalists. What do you think happens next? Revenge. Of course, revenge. Polish partisans start launching their own attacks on Ukrainian villages. Not immediately, not on the same scale at first, but by late 1943 and into 1944, it's happening. Ukrainian civilians in mixed areas become targets. The violence becomes a spiral, each side justifying their actions by pointing to what the other did last week, last month. It becomes a two-sided ethnic war happening inside Nazi-occupied territory. And the Germans sometimes just watch. Sometimes they arm one side. Sometimes they use the chaos to round up more forced laborers. The whole region descends into a nightmare. Here's what's so mind-bending about this. All of this is happening while World War II is still raging. The Eastern Front is still active. German and Soviet armies are fighting massive battles. The Holocaust is ongoing. Jews in these regions are being systematically murdered in 1942 and 1943, and somehow, in the midst of all this apocalyptic violence, Poles and Ukrainians find the time and energy to massacre each other over historical grievances and nationalist dreams. Let me tell you about what the actual violence looked like, because understanding the brutality matters. This wasn't battlefield combat. Survivors reported families being burned alive in their homes. Pregnant women were targeted. Children were killed in front of their parents, parents in front of their children. Churches were set on fire with people locked inside. The violence was designed to terrify, to traumatize so deeply that survivors would never come back. And it worked. In villages where Poles got advance warning, they'd barricade themselves in churches or manor houses and try to hold out. Sometimes they succeeded long enough for help to arrive. More often they didn't. The UPA had numbers and surprise on their side. They'd attack at night, at harvest time when men were in the fields, during winter when movement was difficult. They were strategic about when and where they struck. By 1944, the violence spread into Eastern Galicia. Galicia had been more developed than Volhynia, more urban with stronger Polish institutions. But that didn't protect it. The UPA expanded operations. The pattern repeated. Villages surrounded, populations massacred or scattered. The Polish self-defense units got more organized, more brutal in response. The cycle of revenge was self-sustaining now. And then the Red Army came back. Summer 1944. The Soviets launched massive offensives and start retaking everything the Germans had conquered. The front lines roll westward, the Germans retreat. And suddenly, both the UPA and the Polish underground are facing a new reality. The Soviets are returning, and they're not happy with anyone who's been operating independently. The Soviets didn't stop the ethnic violence out of humanitarian concern. They stopped it because they wanted control. They disarmed Polish Home Army units, often arresting the officers. They hunted UPA fighters who now became anti-Soviet partisans. Some UPA units would keep fighting the Soviets until the early 1950s, hiding in the forests, launching guerrilla attacks. But the organized massacres? Those largely ended when Soviet control was re-established. Not because the hatred disappeared, but because there was now a power in charge that would shoot anyone who tried. What came next was displacement on a massive scale. Stalin and the new Polish communist government agreed to population exchanges. Poles in the eastern territories and what was now Soviet Ukraine were repatriated to Poland. Hundreds of thousands of people forced to leave their homes, their land, everything their families had built for generations. They were packed into trains and moved west, into the new Polish territories, land that had just been taken from Germany. Ukrainians who had ended up on the Polish side of the new border, they got similar treatment. Operation Vistula in 1947 forcibly relocated over 140,000 Ukrainians from southeastern Poland to the western and northern territories, deliberately scattering them to prevent any future organized resistance. The stated goal was security. The real goal was to unmix the populations to prevent this from ever happening again by making sure Poles and Ukrainians didn't live near each other. So let's talk about the human toll, because the numbers are almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate between 60,000 and 100,000 Polish civilians were killed in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia between 1943 and 1945, most killed by the UPA in 1943 and 1944. Several thousand to tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians were killed in retaliatory actions by Polish forces. The exact numbers? We'll never know. Records were destroyed, bodies were never found, entire families vanished with no one left to report them missing. Think about what it means for 1,000 villages to disappear. Not just the people, but the culture, the memory, the stories. Churches that had stood for 300 years burned. Cemeteries destroyed, the gravestones smashed. Archives documenting births, marriages, deaths, gone. For the survivors, it meant losing not just family, but entire communities' whole ways of life. There are people alive today whose grandparents came from villages that no longer exist, whose names only survive in a handful of documents and fading memories. The cultural erasure was deliberate. The UPA didn't just want Poles gone from the territory, they wanted Polish presence erased from history. After the war, Soviet authorities completed the job in a different way. Villages weren't rebuilt. The sites were plowed under or left to forest. The Soviet narrative focused on the Great Patriotic War, on Soviet heroism against fascism. Local ethnic conflicts? Those were complicated, divisive, better left unmentioned. For decades, survivors couldn't openly discuss what happened to them. In communist Poland, you couldn't talk about it either. The official line was Soviet-Polish friendship. Mentioning that Ukrainians had massacred Poles or that Poles had retaliated against Ukrainians didn't fit the narrative. Survivor testimonies were collected quietly, kept in private archives, not published. The same thing happened in Soviet Ukraine. The UPA was labeled as fascist bandits. Any Ukrainian who suggested they were fighting for independence was suspect. The whole period was buried under layers of propaganda and enforced silence. But here's the thing about historical truth, it doesn't stay buried forever. After 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed and both Poland and Ukraine became independent, the archives started opening. Historians got access to documents. Survivors, now elderly, began speaking publicly. And the debates exploded. What do you call what happened? A massacre? Ethnic cleansing? Genocide? In Poland, many use the term genocide. In Ukraine, it's more controversial. The UPA is seen by many Ukrainians as freedom fighters who were fighting for independence against Polish colonialism and Soviet imperialism. The violence against Polish civilians? That's downplayed or contextualized as tragic but inevitable in wartime. This isn't just academic, this is politics. In Ukraine, especially after 2014, there's been a push to commemorate UPA fighters as national heroes. Streets get named after UPA commanders. Statues go up. For Poles, this is deeply painful. It feels like honoring the people who murdered their grandparents. In Poland, there are memorials to the victims of Volhynia, and the national discourse treats it as a genocidal crime. For Ukrainians, especially those fighting Russian aggression, the UPA represents resistance against imperial domination, and they resist what they see as Polish attempts to demonize their entire national liberation movement. The presidents of both countries have tried to bridge this gap. In 2016, the Polish and Ukrainian parliaments issued statements acknowledging the tragic nature of the violence and calling for reconciliation. But on the ground, in local communities, the wounds are still raw. There are mixed Polish-Ukrainian reconciliation ceremonies at massacre sites. There are also protests. History isn't past here, it's present, shaping how these nations interact today, and we need to pay attention to this, especially now. Poland and Ukraine are neighbors. They're both facing pressure from Russia. They need each other as allies. But this history, if not handled carefully, can poison the relationship. When Ukraine glorifies UPA commanders who ordered the massacres, it infuriates Poland. When Poland demands Ukraine condemn its entire independence movement because of what happened in Volhynia, Ukrainians feel like their struggle for sovereignty is being dismissed. Finding a way to honor victims without denying either nation's complex history, that's the challenge. What does this teach us? What's the lesson we're supposed to take from over 1,000 villages erased and 100,000 people murdered? Here's what I think. It shows how fast civilization can collapse when extremism meets opportunity. The Poles and Ukrainians who lived in Volhynia weren't savages. There were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, parents. They went to churches and synagogues, celebrated harvests, married across ethnic lines sometimes. They had tensions, sure, but they coexisted. And then war came. Totalitarian powers crushed the region, first the Soviets, then the Nazis, then the Soviets again. Normal governance disappeared. The rule of law evaporated. Authority fragmented, and extremists filled the vacuum. The OUN-UPA leadership saw their chance to create an ethnically pure Ukrainian state and didn't care what methods they used. They convinced themselves that removing the Polish population was necessary, justified, even righteous. And once the violence started, once the first massacres happened, retaliation became inevitable. The cycle fed itself. This is what's terrifying. It doesn't take that much to turn neighbors into murderers. Give them a nationalist ideology that dehumanizes the other. Give them weapons and a power vacuum. Give them grievances, real or imagined, and tell them violence is justified to right historical wrongs. Remove the structures that normally enforce law and punish murder, and then watch what happens. The people who carried out these killings, most of them weren't psychopaths. They were true believers. They thought they were fighting for their nation's freedom, for their land, for justice. The Polish partisans who retaliated, they thought they were defending their people, avenging their murdered families. Everyone had a justification. Everyone could point to atrocities the other side committed first. And that's how 100,000 people end up dead and 1,000 villages end up erased. One survivor, a Polish woman named Helena Klis, described returning to her village after the war. She'd escaped a UPA raid by hiding in a forest. When she came back 3 years later, there was nothing. The houses were gone, the church was gone, even the roads were growing over. She said she couldn't orient herself. She knew her home had been there, but without any landmarks, she couldn't find the exact spot. It was like the village had been deleted from reality. That image haunts me. A woman standing in an empty field trying to remember where her childhood home once stood. There's a memorial now near the village of Sochrin in Poland, where in 1944, Polish forces massacred over 600 Ukrainian civilians in retaliation for UPA attacks. The monument lists the names of the dead, entire families, babies, grandparents. Reading those names, you realize these weren't soldiers. These were people whose only crime was being Ukrainian when the Polish partisans wanted revenge. On the Ukrainian side, there are similar memorials listing Polish victims. Children, whole families, people burned alive or hacked to death because they were on the wrong side of the ethnic line. Both sides have victims, both sides have perpetrators. And that's uncomfortable for nationalist narratives that want clear heroes and villains. The truth is messy and painful for everyone. Acknowledging that Ukrainians committed atrocities doesn't erase the fact that Polish also committed atrocities. Acknowledging that the UPA had legitimate grievances about Polish rule doesn't justify massacring Polish civilians. You have to hold both truths at once, and that's hard. The historians who study this, Polish historians like Władysław and Avis Yamasko, Ukrainian historians like Ivan Ilchuk and Mykola Pasivnich, they're trying to document what happened as accurately as possible. They're compiling lists of victims, finding witnesses, mapping destroyed villages. It's painstaking, heartbreaking work, and it's necessary. Because if we don't know what happened, if we let the victims be forgotten, then we're complicit in the erasure. Here's what's maybe most important. This isn't ancient history. My grandfather's generation lived through this. There are people alive today who survived these massacres as children. Their testimony is still available. In another 20 years, the last survivors will be gone and will lose that direct connection to what happened. That's why documenting it now, teaching it honestly, matters so much. And for young people in Poland and Ukraine today, this history is shaping their present in ways they might not even realize. The narratives they're taught, the memorials they see, the names on their street signs, all of it is telling them a story about who their heroes are, who their enemies were, and what their nation stands for. If Poland teaches that Ukraine refuses to acknowledge genocide, that creates distrust. If Ukraine teaches that the UPA were pure heroes with no stains on their record, that's a lie. Both countries need to teach the complexity, the tragedy, the moral ambiguity of what happened. Can you believe we're still arguing about this? 80 years later, and we can't agree on what to call it or how to remember it. But maybe that's human. Maybe historical reconciliation is always this hard, this slow, this painful. Germany and Poland eventually found a way to acknowledge the past and move forward. France and Germany did the same. It takes generations, but it's possible. Volhynia reminds us that when history becomes vengeance, when grievances become justifications for mass murder, everyone loses. The Poles lost their communities in the East. The Ukrainians lost their chance to build support for independence through peaceful means. Both lost their humanity in those killing fields. The 1,000 villages that disappeared, they're monuments to the cost of ethnic hatred, to what happens when we decide our neighbor is our enemy because of the language they speak or the church they attend. So what do we do with this knowledge? We remember. We tell the stories of the victims, Polish and Ukrainian both. We refuse to let nationalist narratives simplify the tragedy or erase the complexity. We acknowledge that our side, whatever side that is, wasn't entirely innocent. And we commit to never letting it happen again, to never letting ethnic hatred and extremist ideology turn neighbors into murderers. Because here's the final truth. Those 1,000 villages didn't just disappear. They were erased by human choices, by people who decided that their national dream was worth murdering for. And if we forget that, if we let ourselves believe it couldn't happen again, we're setting ourselves up for the next catastrophe. The empty fields of Volhynia are a warning. The question is whether we're willing to listen.